All right, me again. One of the great privileges of this job is to be able to talk about the wonderful people that I get to work with. Of course, have Frankie, who's just an extraordinary job being managing our K through 12 programs. Reach out to her again with any ideas that you have. You've met our fantastic students. They're really a delight to have in the classroom, to have in our building, and to be working here. Get to introduce friends like Bill Lyons and Andy Bush. And now I have the distinct privilege of hiring someone who I've had the privilege of hiring twice. Did I say that right? This is the only person I've been able to hire twice in my career. So before I came here to the University of Tennessee, I was out in Colorado, at the University of Colorado, Colorado Springs, and we had been doing a search. And I was department chair there, and we were able to hire Tiffany Barron, who's going to be speaking to you in a few minutes. And shortly after we hired her, I was contacted about the position here. And literally one of the first things I thought when I heard about the position was, if I were to be hired for this position, I'd have to figure out a way to bring her to Tennessee. And it turns out there were other people who were thinking the exact same thing, who were involved with helping establish the Institute of American Civics, who knew about her and her work. So she went to Colorado after finishing her PhD at Princeton 2 years ago now, this summer, 2 years ago. And she taught for a semester out there and then came here to the University of Tennessee to work in the Institute of American Civics. She also is the very first faculty member that I was able to hire at the Institute of American Civics. I think you're going to be in for a really wonderful treat hearing from her. She is someone, when I was thinking about this institute, I knew we needed people who understood the nature of the ideas animating the American constitutional traditions, the philosophy behind it, but they also had this global perspective and experience and expertise. And she just has a deep, deep knowledge of East Asia, of China, of Taiwan. Remember, I think it was at during her job talk for Colorado, she was talking about how she had to read some documents for her dissertation, so she had to teach herself classical Chinese. Like, oh, well, I couldn't do that. Yeah, she is just a remarkably talented scholar and teacher. So please join me in welcoming Tiffany Barron.
Just going to leave that there. So I hope I can live up to that introduction. By way of further introduction, my background is in studying things like civil conflict, civil society, virtue ethics, all these highly theoretical things. But I tend to, or I have in the past, looked at some of those topics from the perspective of early modern China. So early 20th century China, Chinese warlords. That's why I had to teach myself a little bit of classical Chinese, because I was reading a diary of a Chinese warlord. And even though I read modern Chinese, I said, well, I don't know what he's talking about because there's just a lot of classical Chinese, so I need to learn classical Chinese. So I have also lived in Taiwan, and Taiwan is a place that's very near and dear to my heart. So you'll see Taiwan come up in this talk a bit. So this talk is called The Transformation of U.S. Foreign Policy, China and America's Pivot to Asia. So I'm going to, hopefully this green button works. Yes, okay. So by way of brief outline, we'll start off with just a rough outline of where we are currently in U.S.-China relations. Before getting into how we get here, so I especially want to put a pin on China's economic development, and then also a little primer on what's called cross-strait relations. So by strait, I mean the Taiwan Strait. So when you see cross-strait, that means relations between China and Taiwan. As I said, that's a topic that's personally near and dear to my heart because I've lived in Taiwan. Taiwan is my second home. And then we'll end with a bit on the future of U.S.-China relations. What should the U.S.'s strategy be? Obviously, that's a big conversation right now, a big debate happening right now. But we'll start first with this issue of where are we now? So, where are we now? Well, I'm going to group this into two categories. The first box are the economic tensions, or some of the economic tensions. The second box are kind of these military and strategic tensions. So on the economic side, I think everyone here can probably guess what the big word is. Like, what is the big word right now with these economic tariffs and specifically, or more broadly, trade, right? Trade. So if you've been paying attention over the past several years, even prior to the Trump administration, these accusations of China having unfair trade practices have been legion. This is not just a Trump administration accusation. This has been going on for years and years and years. So for instance, last year during the Biden administration, the U.S. Government Accountability Office accused China of unfair trade practices, including forced labor, theft of sensitive technologies, and trade in illicit goods. So this is something that's been discussed for years prior to the current administration. I want to put a pin on just a few of those issues related to so-called unfair trade practices. So the one that comes up a lot is intellectual property, intellectual property, intellectual property. There have been long-standing accusations, and I think I have this. No, I don't. Okay. There have been long-standing accusations that China steals American intellectual property, specifically to produce counterfeit products and to access trade secrets. So the National Bureau of Asian Research, as far back as 2017, estimated that annually, theft of intellectual property from China cost the U.S. economy between $225 billion and $600 billion. And that's not overall, that's annually. And this was back in 2017. So when we talk about this theft of intellectual property, some of it is because the Chinese government will often require firms that want to operate in China to transfer technology and other capabilities to actors in China in order for them to basically operate in the country. So this has been a long-standing source of tension. Another source of tension has been around this issue of dual-use technologies. Dual-use technologies. The dual use is civilian and military. So I should say that both the U.S. and China in recent years have become increasingly concerned about this issue of dual-use technologies. So these are technologies that can have a civilian use and they can also have a military use. And both the U.S. and China in recent years have been placing restrictions on exporting these goods. Another issue that comes up a lot related to trade is this issue of state-subsidized firms in China. So companies outside of China will complain that they can't compete with Chinese companies. Why is that? Well, many of the Chinese companies will receive large amounts of money, large amounts of subsidies from the Chinese government, which companies outside of China will say amounts to an unfair trade practice. Another issue that you'll hear about a lot probably in the news is currency manipulation. So the claim is that China will manipulate its currency in order to make its exports cheaper in the global economy, but make U.S. imports more expensive in China. And then finally, as I mentioned in the beginning, people have complaints about things like forced labor in Xinjiang and poor working conditions more broadly. So all of these amount to long-standing, many tensions over trade. And of course, the U.S.-China trade war, trade truce has been in the news a lot over the past few months, so I won't belabor that point. But I will say that President Trump has stated that he wants to make China more open to U.S. imports. But China, especially over the past few years, has actually become less interested in foreign imports. So it's not clear over the long term what's going to happen there. Last point, too, with this ongoing trade war and so-called trade truce, I think a big part of what has helped to bring about this trade truce, insofar as there's a rough truce right now, is this issue of rare earth minerals, which again, we're all hearing a lot about in the news. Why are these rare earths so important? Well, we need them for cars. We need them for televisions. We need them for robotics. We need them for weapons. We need them for lasers. Just across a range of industries, rare earths are necessary. Guess who is the primary source of rare earths? China. 96% of rare earths are sourced from China. So again, with these questions about where is this trade war going to go, who has more leverage in this war, keep an eye on this rare earths issue. Again, it's just a truce. I think basically we're at a 6-month truce when it comes to the rare earths, so we'll see what happens. Somewhat related to trade is this idea of there being a China shock. So this term China shock refers to the loss of manufacturing jobs in the US and Europe since China joined the WTO. So I should say that there's been an overall trend actually since the 1970s of the US losing manufacturing jobs. So this trend predates China entering the World Trade Organization, the WTO. However, after China entered the WTO, you could say that this trend accelerated. So by that I mean that between 1980 and 2000, and China enters the WTO around 2000. So between 1980 and 2000, the U.S. loses 2 million manufacturing jobs. Between 2000 and 2017, the U.S. loses 5.5 million manufacturing jobs. So you have roughly 2 million lost in the 20 years prior to China entering the WTO, and then another 5.5 million lost over the 17 years after that. So a group of economists, you don't need to know their names per se, but they've found in 2016 that actually the costs of boosting trade with China were more pronounced than the costs from boosting trade with other countries, and that there have not been offsetting kind of employment gains in other sectors. A similar paper in 2021 found that the China shock accounted for 59.3% of all U.S. manufacturing job losses between 2001 and 2019. So this is a big topic that economists are talking about, and obviously it's a big topic that politicians are talking about. I would say that people aren't crazy then to think, okay, trade with China has had an impact on the manufacturing sector, even though this is a long-standing trend that started well before China entered the World Trade Organization. On the security tension, so I'm going to bring up this issue of weapons and technology, and then I'm going to talk about just a few different regional tensions with other countries. Weapons and technology, the big thing that we've all been hearing about recently is probably hypersonic missiles. So China has the most advanced hypersonic missile capability in the world. By hypersonic missile, I mean that they travel like more than 5 times the speed of sound. So we're talking about Mach 5. So they have the most advanced hypersonic missile capability in the world. They also have the world's largest navy. So they have most recent estimates, just over 370 ships and submarines. And according to, this is coming from a leaked Navy slide, but their shipbuilding capacity is more than 200 times the U.S. So that's giving a lot of people in the U.S. some pause. Like, okay, world's largest Navy, most advanced hypersonic missile capability. They have far greater shipbuilding capacity. They have been making investments in aircraft carriers, in stealth-capable submarines, and AI-driven systems. They've developed these so-called, quote-unquote, anti-access area denial capabilities. And in recent years, they have also been increasing their nuclear capability. Now, they have a little over 600 nuclear weapons, which, for context, the U.S. has around 3,700. nuclear weapons, and Russia has like 4,300. So they're still far behind the US and Russia. But their nuclear capabilities have been increasing. Speaking of Russia, we all know that Russia and China they've been developing this strategic partnership. There's been some language about, they have some very strong language about how close they are. I'll just say that the reality is that despite the rhetoric, there is something of a qualified and imbalanced relationship between Russia and China. China definitely has the edge in this relationship, by which I mean that Russia is in many ways heavily dependent on China. And China does not seem to want to get too involved with Russia. So it wants to support Russia, but not support Russia to the extent that it's antagonizing the West too much, because it does not want overt conflict with the West. It wants to have its trade with Europe, etc. So China definitely has the edge in this relationship. Similarly with Iran, China also has the edge there. And even though they have this partnership, it's not clear that Iran is more important to China than the Gulf countries are to China. So if you know anything about Iran, you know they have a contentious relationship with some of the Gulf countries. But these Gulf countries, economically speaking, are probably more important to China than Iran. So even though they have this relationship, again, China is not necessarily like gung-ho, like you are my best friend and I will do everything for you, despite rhetoric to the contrary. South China Sea, not going to say much here, except again, if you pay attention to the news, this has been in the news as recently as, probably today. China has a lot of territorial disputes with countries like Vietnam and Brunei and Taiwan and the Philippines, and it's been very, very, very contentious with the Philippines in the South China Sea. I think about 2 days ago, some Filipino fishermen were aided by a Filipino, probably government vessel. There was a clash with Chinese vessels, water cannons were fired. This kind of clash, this kind of tension has been ongoing in the South China Sea. And the big one, and we'll come back to Taiwan later, but Taiwan is definitely the big one. Just going to highlight that this has been heating up. The Taiwan issue has definitely been heating up. There have been large-scale military exercises conducted around Taiwan, and they're simulating blockades, and there's this growing fear that China is using essentially salami tactics, like slowly slicing that salami, and you keep having this simulated blockades until one day you wake up and, oh, it's a real blockade. In addition to the military exercises, espionage has become a big problem in Taiwan. And this espionage is happening in the military. It's happening from top government officials' aides who are essentially spying for China, giving information to China. So that's been an increasing problem, especially over the past few months. That's been in the news a lot. The president is reinstituting a kind of military tribunal to try to deal with all the espionage, but that's something else to keep in mind. So this is the current state of the world, in very, very, very brief. So the question is, how has the second Trump administration been dealing with all of these issues? So by way of context, many people would say that the first Trump administration helped to solidify a bipartisan consensus about China. So during the first Trump administration, both sides of the aisle agreed China is our foremost strategic competitor. So his first administration helped to solidify that consensus. Some people would say that the second Trump administration is somewhat upending that consensus that it helped to build. Or if not upending that consensus, perhaps tempering some of the language around China and discussion of China and its potential threat. So Michael Herson, for instance, he was the U.S. Treasury's representative to China during 2014 and 2016. His way of framing the issue is that the second Trump administration is essentially taking a more transactional and pragmatic approach, essentially. So the second Trump administration is trying to downplay some of the ideological strife, you could say, downplay some of this issue of democracy promotion, things like that, and focus more on maximizing benefits, especially economic benefits for America. I will note, however, at the same time that Defense Secretary Hegseth recently has made a statement just trying to reassure allies in the Asia Pacific, like, we still do care about China. So he made a statement that there would be devastating consequences for the Indo-Pacific and the world if China sought to conquer Taiwan. And then he said, if deterrence fails, and if called upon by the commander-in-chief, we are prepared to fight and win decisively. So if deterrence fails, if China does invade Taiwan, and if the commander-in-chief decides it's necessary, then the U.S. is willing to fight and win decisively in Taiwan. So that's a statement that he made recently in trying to reassure allies that the U.S. is not backed away from the Asia-Pacific. All that being said, despite all of the talk in the news about the trade war, X, Y, and Z, it's not quite clear that tensions are actually rising between the U.S. and China. And this gets back to this de-emphasis on maybe quote-unquote ideology and this taking of a more pragmatic approach. It's not actually clear that tensions are rising between China and the U.S. And I would say that the Trump administration has taken a relatively muted approach to China, and China is typically relatively muted, relatively, of course, in what they say about the U.S. But the last point to keep in mind there is, again, this sense that allies in the Asia-Pacific need to be reassured. Some of that is because with the trade wars and questions of tariffs and recent rhetoric, there is this sense that the U.S. might be alienating more traditional partners. So how did we get here? If that's the state of the world now, that's the rough state of where we are now, how did we get here? Because obviously the world, not even that long ago, frankly, looked quite different. So I want to give you all an overall conceptual framing of phases of how we have in the U.S. related to China. So prior to the 1970s, and I should clarify, when I say prior to the 1970s, I mean starting in 1949, so starting from the inauguration of the People's Republic of China. So from 1949 to the 1970s, the U.S. position towards China was one of containment, isolation. That changed to a strategy of engagement and integration and assistance. Around 2016, this starts shifting again. You start to hear more conversations about rebalancing. And from 2016 on, especially, tensions seem to keep rising. So you can think of it as movement from skepticism, hostility, to a kind of qualified optimism, to more skepticism, devolving a bit more into outright hostility and tensions. So these are the overall phases of U.S.-China relations. This first phase, we're not going to talk much about this issue of containment and isolation, this idea that the U.S. wanted to deter China, and we wanted to defend, allies in the region, and we wanted to isolate China economically and diplomatically. What I want to hone in on is that middle period from the 1970s to around 2016, because that's the period that's immediately preceding where we are now. Like all of that stuff that I gave now, all the complaints and tensions, and yada, 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 that's all coming after this period of optimism where we're focused on engagement and integration and helping China. So what precipitated that? Well, some of it is the choice to recognize China, which I'll mention a bit more about later. But some of this is because of the so-called reform and opening up. After Mao Zedong died in 1976, the new leader, Deng Xiaoping, rises. And Deng is very different from Mao. So for those of you who know anything about Mao Zedong, you know he was a very, very, very charismatic and very ideological leader. Ideology came first. And that's how you get things like the Cultural Revolution, where millions of people are incarcerated or died or injured, or the Great Leap Forward, where the estimates are 18 to 32 million people died of starvation. He dies in 1976, and the country is exhausted. So when Deng Xiaoping comes into power, he's like, we've got to fix things, like everything is going to collapse if nothing changes. So the China that Deng inherits is very different from the China now. The China at the end of the Mao Zedong era is not only very, 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 very poor. There's no FDI. There is almost no foreign trade. There's no private property rights. The government has essentially complete control over the economy. People don't generally have freedom of movement. People are afraid to express their opinions. And people are generally scarred, not just by that period, but the preceding periods of the Chinese Civil War and the warlord era. And people are just tired. They're exhausted from 1911 to 1976. It's just been war, 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 fighting, 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 famine, 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 to be quite honest. The China by the early 2000s is very, very different. Obviously, by the point that we get to now, you have China as one of the top 2 economies in the world. You have a substantial middle class. You have high growth rates. You have a class of entrepreneurs who value conspicuous consumption. And with that comes income inequality. So everyone is not flat anymore. Now you have very rich people. And a lot of that is because of Deng Xiaoping and his reform and opening up. So I'm not going to actually show you these videos, but for those who are interested, these 2 videos kind of just show you images from China, comparing China from the 1970s to current day China, and they give you a sense, just to get a visual sense in your mind of how rapidly China changed. It's actually quite incredible, the transformation of China over the past few decades. Again, starting with Deng Xiaoping and his reform and opening up. So the official reform and opening up period is really from 1976 to 1989. And the key thing to remember there is this movement from ideological legitimacy to what scholars will say is performance-based legitimacy. Deng Xiaoping saw that for the Chinese Communist Party to survive in power, it could not rely on ideology anymore. It could not rely on charisma. They needed to bring home the bacon. They needed to essentially stimulate China's economy, raise people's standard of living, and bring about results. So no more would the CCP be focused on, this Maoist ideology. Now it's all about growth, raise standard of living. You could say, bring home the bacon. And this is what's going to continue even past the Tiananmen Square era, which I'm not going to say much about. I wanted to highlight, though, a few of the key economic reform focus areas. So the reform starts around 1979. Once you get to 1993, that's when the CCP declares our goal is to create a market system, a socialist market economy. By 1999, they're officially sanctioning the development of a private sector. By 2001, private entrepreneurs are allowed to join the Communist Party. So capitalists essentially can join the Chinese Communist Party by 2001. And of course, that's also when China is joining the WTO. So if we go, can I go back to this era of engagement, integration, assistance? A lot of that is coming out of these reforms, this reform and opening up era, and this sense of optimism, this sense that, China is changing. It's reforming economically. That must mean that it will also reform politically, right? Because if a country becomes wealthy, then they're going to become a democracy, or so modernization theory would say. And that's actually the kind of language that even US presidents like Bill Clinton and George Bush would use. Like this idea that if China just develops economically, essentially they will become more like us, which is not actually what we saw. but that was the hope of that era. Really quickly, I want to make a few notes about Taiwan, how Taiwan complicates and fits into this picture. So, for those who don't know, when the Qing dynasty of China, they annexed Taiwan formally in the 17th century. Prior to that, the Dutch had controlled some parts of Taiwan. I think the Spaniards controlled the north for a while. But the Qing dynasty formally annexes Taiwan in the 17th century. When they lose the war with Japan in 1894, 1895, Taiwan becomes a Japanese colony. And that remains the case until Japan loses the war, World War II, right? And the Republic of China officially takes over as the rulers, the leaders, the government of Taiwan. So this is an important historical point. The Republic of China is actually, that's the official name of Taiwan. It's the ROC. But B, if you were to ask someone in China, they would say the Republic of China does not exist anymore as a governing entity. What's governing Taiwan right now is essentially some local sub-state entity, but that's not really the true Republic of China. The true Republic of China, they would say, ended in 1949 when the CCP won the Civil War. So keep that in mind. There's a lot of debate over its language. So the Republic of China, Taiwan, again, important historical point, actually holds China's seat in the UN until the 1970s. So until the 1970s, if you were talking about China in the United Nations, you were talking about Taiwan. Why is that? Part of that reason is because the Republic of China helped us win World War II, right? They fought in the war. That was the China that was fighting in the war. So there's tension, sensitivity over this because Taiwan does lose its seat in the United Nations when the UN and other international organizations in the 1970s decide to switch recognition from the Republic of China to the People's Republic of China. The US actually voted against it, but lost that vote. So Taiwan, the Republic of China, is no longer a part of the UN. Instead, it's the People's Republic of China. And then not long after, several years after, the US officially terminates diplomatic relations with Taiwan. However, the US, by law, is committed to providing defensive arms to Taiwan. So this is why the United States is so implicated in whatever happens with cross-strait relations. We have the so-called Taiwan Relations Act. And by the Taiwan Relations Act, the U.S. is committed to providing defensive arms to Taiwan. It's committed to essentially the peace of the region, and it's committed to maintaining the capacity to intervene to protect Taiwan if necessary. The language is important because we are not committed to defending Taiwan, but we are committed to maintaining the capacity to defend Taiwan. So there's some strategic ambiguity there. China is not sure. Will the U.S. decide to intervene, or will it not decide to intervene should China ever decide to actually invade Taiwan? This is an example of strategic ambiguity. But by law, we are required to at least provide arms to Taiwan and to maintain the capacity to defend Taiwan if necessary. Now, I noted that China is going through all of these economic changes during this time period. The U.S. is becoming so optimistic about China. Taiwan is also going through changes at this time. It's becoming a democracy. So when the Republic of China enters Taiwan, it basically suspends its constitution, it initiates martial law, so they're not a democracy at that point. But by the 90s, it's transitioning to democracy, and you have growing Taiwanese identity. So you have more and more people claiming, I am Taiwanese, I'm not Chinese, I'm Taiwanese. What's the problem with that? The problem is that a core part of Chinese nationalism is reclaiming Taiwan. This is a core part of Chinese nationalism that we have to, this is a core part of quote unquote rejuvenating the Chinese nation, that we have to make the Chinese nation whole again. And the only way to make the Chinese nation whole again is to have Taiwan back. So a core part of Chinese nationalism and a core part of the CCP's legitimacy, its sense of performance, is tied to we need to reunify the country. We all need to be together again. At the same exact time that people in Taiwan, more and more people are saying, I'm Taiwanese, I'm not Chinese. Fewer and fewer people are identifying as Chinese. So we'll have to see what happens there. So the summary of this time period, again, this period of optimism, this period of engagement with China. China's economy moving from closed to open. The CCP ideology moving from being focused on ideology to being focused on performance, the socialist market economy, growing the economy. China, the PRC, is taking over the Republic of China, Taiwan's seat in the UN. Taiwan also changing from authoritarian to democratic. And America's stance towards the People's Republic of China is moving from, again, containment to engagement. So no longer trying to isolate China, we're trying to engage with China. And its stance towards the Republic of China, towards Taiwan, is moving from recognition to strategic ambiguity. Strategic ambiguity. That is where things stood in 2016 in our optimistic phase before we start transitioning into the current phase. And that transition starts happening during the Obama era. So as an example of that, so Obama continues like this vein of engagement, this vein of integration and assistance through things like the strategic and economic dialogues. So this was it was an Obama-era initiative, but it actually grew out of a Bush-era initiative where the Departments of Treasury and State took the lead, but other departments participated. They would meet every few years with their Chinese counterparts in this big dialogue. And the U.S. and China, we would kind of work together to hammer out priorities before multilateral summits to come to agreements. One of the agreements was over something as simple as getting, I think it was like an email address in case like satellites were going to collide, because prior to that we could only fax the relevant Chinese authorities, and hey, that's not enough time before satellites collide. So that's demonstrating kind of this sense of engagement integration. However, at the same time, the Obama administration wanted to start hedging against some of the risks. By 2016, and towards the end of the Obama administration, really earlier, like 2012, we're starting to see, okay, there are a lot of risks to this relationship. So that's where you get this language of this pivot to Asia, this Obama-era strategic term to basically say the U.S. needs to be the leader in Asia. The U.S. needs to be a prominent player in Asia. We need to focus more on Asia. We did not necessarily perceive that as trying to contain China. More accurately, perhaps, it was a quote-unquote rebalancing. But many in China perceived that as the U.S. trying to contain China. So from their perspective, a bit more of a contentious term. And again, the tensions are rising during the first Trump administration. Not going to belabor that. Tensions continuing to rise during the Obama administration. Again, we don't need to belabor that because it's been clear. If you even look at public opinion surveys in 2011, people in the U.S. and China, very favorable views of each other. By now, very negative views of each other. So we've seen this rise in tensions. So the question becomes then, what is the future? What should the U.S.'s posture be towards China as we continue in this third phase of our relationship with the People's Republic of China? This phase of more tension and hopefully not, but maybe even contention. So Harry Harding, he is a political science scholar. He's the former dean of the Elliott School of International Relations at George Washington University. He kind of laid out three groups of potential pathways. three groups of opinions, you can say, on how the U.S. should manage its relationship to China in the coming years. So we have this kind of stay the course pathway. We have what he calls a strike a deal pathway and the toughen up pathway. So the stay the course pathway is, as you might imagine, is relatively status quo. And he's writing this a few years ago, so just to clarify, this was a few years ago, so stay the course was the status quo of a few years ago, not necessarily the status quo of now. But the idea of the stay the course pathway is continue to engage with China, continue to integrate with China, continue with this policy of engagement, integration, and hopefully things will get better. So for an example of this kind of argument, you could think of the former Secretary of the Treasury, or former Secretaries of the Treasury, Robert Rubin and Henry Paulson. So they had this kind of argument that if both countries can just get their house in order economically, if both countries can just have economic success, then we can develop a mutually beneficial relationship. Or you can think of a political scientist like Thomas Christensen, who's like, we just need to encourage China to be a more responsible stakeholder. Or Kevin Rudd, who wants to integrate China into the international system, but also reform these institutions to better reflect Chinese strategic concerns. So that's the stay the course perspective. Then you get a strike a deal perspective, which you can think of as being actually more accommodationist. So the stay the course perspective is still hoping somewhat to not just stabilize relations with China, but to make China a more responsible stakeholder. The strike a deal perspective is like, we just need to strike a deal and accommodate China. We don't need to worry so much about getting them to play by our rules. We just strike a deal. We just need to bargain and make major concessions to China. So an example of that perspective would come from Dr. Lyle Goldstein, who says we need to meet China halfway. So his way of meeting China halfway is saying we need to make small reciprocal compromises that become larger over time. Charles Glaser, different scholar, has a provocative argument that the U.S. needs to end its commitment to defend Taiwan in exchange for resolving peacefully China's other territorial disputes. So essentially, we make a deal with China, like, hey, you take Taiwan, but peacefully resolve all of these other territorial disputes that you have going on with all of these other countries right now. Michael Swain, another example, he suggests that the U.S. abandons any intention of preserving strategic preeminence in Asia. So don't even try to be the dominant power in Asia anymore. We just need to maintain a balance of power with China where neither country dominates Asia. We just need to maintain a balance. So these are all kind of strike a deal sort of proposals. The last bunch of proposals, the toughen up school, is basically the U.S. needs to toughen up. So you can think, for those of you who have read international relations, the international relations literature, you might be familiar with John Mearsheimer or someone like Aaron Friedberg. These are the kind of people who are like, the U.S. just needs to toughen up. So the U.S. needs to strengthen its military position in Asia. It needs to strengthen its alliances. It needs to increase pressure on Beijing. It needs to reduce and eliminate U.S. assistance to China. It needs to exert more control over technology transfers and maybe even have tariffs. The most extreme version of this argument would be to say, and by extreme, I just mean that descriptively, like the most extreme version of the argument would be like the U.S. completely needs to contain China. So you end up with like these three rough schools of thought. Of course, actual proposals are not necessarily going to fall 100% in one school or another. People might propose policies where there's a mixed bag, or they might pull from multiple categories. But you can, by and large, see these as these are where a lot of the debates are playing out, or have been playing out over the past several years. One final debate that's playing out now is related to the economy, and of course how that relates to the strategic issue, which is who actually has more economic leverage, the US or China. Up until around 2022, people were very concerned that China, we were surpassing the US, China's growing, yada, yada, yada. Then you get to around 2022, people start to say, oh, China's stagnating, and so then you get more exuberance and optimism about the US's position. But people are actively debating this issue right now. Who actually has more leverage? Who has more leverage in terms of this trade war? But then who has more leverage in terms of turning this economic power and human resources into military might? Who can withstand military conflict the longest? So that's an active debate going on right now as well. And I will leave you all with some important considerations based on the talk that all boil down to what should the U.S.'s strategic priorities be. And with that, we'll open up for Q&A.
Thank you for that fascinating talk. I was wondering if you could talk about how India fits into this, because I know a lot of the foreign policy experts have talked about the U.S. Kind of building a stronger alliance with India in a sense to try to balance out China's power in the region. Yeah,
that's a really good question. I would say India is a wild card right now. India is just a wild card. So from India is concerned about China, but India is very concerned about Pakistan and its relationship with Pakistan. However, very often when India is talking about Pakistan, it'll also make reference to China. It'll say China is the veiled power perhaps behind developments in Pakistan. So I think the best that I can say right now is that India is a bit of a wild card. There are discussions with the so-called Quad countries, but that's not a formal alliance. But that is an attempt to better integrate strategic and economic relations amongst Quad countries. So we'll have to see what happens.
Hi, and thank you. I want to ask a question about, you mentioned that the century of humiliation has a big impact on the way that China thinks about Taiwan. Is that also shaping the way that the United States thinks about its foreign policy towards China and Taiwan?
For clarification, are you asking if the U.S. makes reference to the century of humiliation when it formulates its policy?
Yeah. Does it consider that in their policy making?
That's a hard question to answer because I'm not in the room where it happens, so I don't know what kinds of conversations actually come up. I would be very surprised if that's a big part of how the U.S. makes decisions. Something that I've noticed is that I think China scholars and people who focus on Chinese domestic politics, they will care more about things like the century of humiliation and things of that nature. I'm not so sure that U.S. policymakers are necessarily thinking of China in those terms. I think they're probably thinking of China more in terms of the economic and military threat, not why is it that an ordinary person might support the CCP.
Thank you for that fascinating talk. I was just curious if you'd heard the theories of a guy by the name of Peter Zeihan, a book called Disunited Nations, where he basically says that he's thinking that China may not even be able to hold together as a political entity within the next 50 years because of what they've done to themselves with the one-child policy, and then the additional problem of female infanticides and abortions because of families wanting a boy to carry on the family name. And so there's a huge deficit of young people kind of creating a real problem for their economy and their ability to kind of hold things together. And now we see that, some of Xi's people are being sidelined, and we wonder if he's even in charge anymore. So your thoughts on the potential future. I know that there's people who have these kind of more catastrophic kind of visions of what might happen with China. Just any thoughts on that?
I'm a little skeptical of that idea. So on the demographic front, so the demographic problem is very, very, very real. However, most recently what I've heard is that there's actually been a little bit of a baby bump. Like the kids under 14, there's actually been growth in that demographic. So it's not totally clear to me what China's demographics are going to look like 2-3 decades from now. China got rid of the one-child policy, and now they're trying to initiate these very pro-natalist policies. They're trying to encourage people to have more children. I'm not sure over the long term how well it will work or not, but they are trying to encourage people to have more children. So I'm not totally sure what demographics are going to end up looking like in China. In terms of the stability of the system, I lean towards thinking that the system itself is relatively stable. Like, you do hear about professionals, especially the professional class, has complaints about the recent direction of Chinese politics for understandable reasons. And you hear about people who don't like Xi Jinping, again, understandable. But just because they don't like the current direction of the party or they don't like the direction of Xi Jinping doesn't necessarily translate into they're going to push for regime change. And I think that's the gap that I'm just not seeing. Like, where's the push for regime change? Where is the grassroots movement for not even just democracy, but in public opinion, like an appetite for regime change? And I'm not really seeing much of that. So I'm a little skeptical of the idea that China is just going to collapse in the next 50 years. But of course, I could be very wrong.
Hello. With the growing dependence globally on Chinese goods in trade, we've also seen a decrease in production, well, not necessarily a decrease in production, but an increase in production in countries around China. And China may become not so much as the cheap labor pool as it once was. Yeah. Will we see an economic dependence on China from the countries surrounding China? And as a result, do they stop being our allies due to economic concerns? Yeah,
so I'm not an economist, so I'm not going to venture a good answer to that question. But part of my answer does tie actually to the previous question. So China over the past few years has been experimenting with trying to create a more self-sufficient economy. And it seems to be working. So they're actually trying to import less, and they're trying to stimulate domestic consumption. And it actually seems that it's working. China is doing just fine not importing more goods, and China is doing just fine trying to, quote unquote, make its economy more self-sufficient. So I'm not an economist, so I'm not going to make predictions about what that's going to do to the regional economy. But I would say China is going in the direction of self-sufficiency, which we should pay attention to.
Hi, my question is about investment in Latin America and Africa, because I went to Peru a few years ago and was really surprised at the level of Chinese investment in Peru. So how is that playing a role in U.S.-China relationships?
I don't know. So again, from the U.S. perspective, I don't know that it's playing as much of a role. I shouldn't say that. I don't know much about the role that it's playing from the perspective of people actually in the administration. I'm more familiar with what that does, or what that's done from the perspective of Taiwan and cross-strait relations, because what's happened over the past 10 to 15 years is that the countries that recognize Taiwan as a legitimate country, they tended to be these poorer countries in like Africa, Latin America. But as China has increased its investments and its leverage over those countries over the past several years, they've been pulling out, they've basically been pulling away from recognizing Taiwan. So it's like every year you hear another announcement, so-and-so country no longer recognizes Taiwan, so-and-so country no longer, we don't have relations with Taiwan anymore. So that's definitely been a factor, and it's Chinese investment in Africa, like in 5G, things like that. It's been a conversation. You obviously have the Belt and Road Initiative. Again, they've been conversations. I don't see that translating into comparable kinds of U.S. investments. I don't think there's much of a political appetite for that in the U.S. right now to start a bunch of infrastructure projects or things like that. So the answer is it just gives China more leverage. Certainly vis-a-vis Taiwan, it's giving it more leverage. But in general, China just has more leverage with some countries because of its investment